This is the Still Human podcast, where in this increasingly dehumanized world, we're fighting to find ways to say, we're still human. I'm Michael, and what follows is a conversation with my dear friend and co-host, Franz. In this episode, we further the discussion from part 1 with a close examination of the 1973 film Belladonna of Sadness. We move through our analysis using the lenses of feminism, the occult, and political power.
I really want to talk about Belladonna.
Yeah.
So the first time I learned about Belladonna, I was about 12 years old, and I was taking an independent school entrance exam, just basically a test to get into private schools. Or I was preparing for it rather, and I learned about Belladonna. It was like one of those prompt questions, but it was like, where you read a passage and you do reading comprehension questions after the fact.
Right.
And I would always suck at them because I always thought they were all so well written. And I'd spend way too much time reading them and like thinking, like pondering about whatever they were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this one passage about Belladonna and how the women in Europe, however many hundreds of years ago, in order to have dilated pupils, because big, wide pupils, and again, like this all speaks to like clearly like you're attempting to have some sort of experience, right? Isn't dilated pupils? That's either uppers. Is that uppers? You get the dilated pupils. Downers is the pinprick pupils.
Maybe. I mean, certainly, dilated pupils happen during psychedelics,
right? And so it was seen as beautiful, attractive for women to have big, giant, dilated pupils. And I'm imagining you can only really see big, giant, dilated pupils on more Nordic people, right? People who have fairer complexion and lighter colored eyes, right? And so they would use the extract from the belladonna to make drops. And you have to be very careful. These young women have to be very careful how many drops they put into each eye, because if you went a little bit too far, it would permanently blind you.
right?
Because it would cut off. It would basically just destroy the blood vessels, right? And I was so fascinated by that. And every time I think even the name Belladonna is supposed to kind of conjure up, because doesn't Belladonna mean like pretty girl or something like that? So it's supposed to conjure up that particular use to make you more beautiful by giving you more dilated pupils.
Right.
So a Belladonna of Sadness.
Mm.
Right. And oh God, man, I love witches.
Yeah, me too.
I love stories about witches. I think, we're talking about control and power. I think there's no greater threat to the structure of the world, the male hegemony, than an empowered woman. Not even like a woman that's necessarily more powerful than you, but just empowered, period.
Right.
I was recently talking to a friend, and I was talking about how when I was a teenage boy in high school, I didn't know that when I would hang out with a girl, go out for a date or whatever, and I would try to coerce her into going down on me or whatever. I didn't know that when I would play these tricks to strip her of her power, to strip her of her reason, to make her doubt herself, to take away her self-confidence and her self-assurance, or self-assuredness at least. I didn't know I'm inheriting that tradition of stripping women of their power, right?
Mm-hmm.
You just do it without even thinking about it. You're a boy. You're born with a penis in this world. It comes natural to you to strip women of their power, to degrade them and to diminish them in value, and as far as what they can contribute, what their inputs are, etc. And so, kind of grown up from that, recognizing how vile I was, recognizing how vile society is when it comes to male control and male dominance. Now I fully love witch tales. Right, there aren't enough of them. There should be like a beautifully filmed, well budgeted witch movie every year. Like every season, not just every year. Like there should just be witch movies. Like there should just be nonstop witch movies. They're so good. I love them.
Yeah, I mean, so like I was saying, that this film like just so happened to kind of intersect with like a lot about the book, and I think the movie is its own thing, and like there's definitely like a lot of implications in the art that take me in a totally different direction, but just like certainly the idea that part of the mysteries school or the mystery religions that were destroyed or seen as a threat, part of what they came with was not just the democratization of the Eucharist, but the empowerment of women too, and as this like central role of gatekeeper for these types of experiences.
I think one of the roles that, and I can't, it's Jan and Jean, right? And Jean,
Yeah.
a vestigial figure after a while, but
Right.
when you look at Jan, what she's really in opposition to, she's I mean, I guess you can argue that she exists in opposition to temptation, to seduction, all of that, of course. But I think the primary opposition, the primary antagonist for for Jan is religion, right? It's how the trappings of religion are used by people who want nothing more or nothing other than power. When we look at the lady of the lands, like she constantly says, like, "Am I not the lady of the lands? Who's in charge here? Aren't I the boss here? Haven't I been given this divine power to be in charge of things? Why am I being challenged?" Even when she's not being directly challenged, right? And it speaks to that reptilian insecurity, that constant dread, that constant existential dread that someone's going to come up and take away what I have, right?
Right.
And I love the fact that the movie, as minimalistic as it is, kind of encapsulates that. I think it's really hard to find media that encapsulates that in an honest way, that doesn't like sugarcoat it as like this individual isn't a byproduct of capitalism or of greed or of power. It's just this character just happens to be bad. It's just a bad leader. But there are good leaders in the world. Like, no, all leadership is terrified. Right. All leadership is terrified of losing power.
Right.
Because that's what power is. You don't attain that much power unless you have a deep hunger for that much power, right? And you're constantly in fear of like starving, despite the fact that you have so much.
Right.
It's a pathology, right? It's a literal pathology. And I love the fact that, as far as I could tell, at least as far as I saw, the movie did a really good job of portraying it as a pathology, right? All the people in the court, despite their best efforts, for instance, the page seems like a nice enough guy. He seems like he could be turned towards the light side, if you will, right? But because he's in such close proximity to power, he's twisted by that, right? He can only ever act in a way that's vile.
Yeah, I mean, just even in the art, like there's those shots of like the kind of royal crew that they're kind of like a panning gang shot,
Right.
And the umbrella that one of the servants is holding up just looks like a bat, just from a distance. So it's just definitely, that's the interesting thing too about the dichotomy between this power that exists that's like clearly depicted as evil and abusive versus literally Satan. And so like which one is more evil is the question.
Well, if Satan is, and I also appreciated that too, because Satan was portrayed as not necessarily like this evil figure, but someone that enabled Jan to have the power to defy the hypocrisy of the existing power structure in that land, right? So, I think having a religious reading of the story could be a little bit complicated. I really don't know how to do that because I don't think it's like theologically sound, right?
Well, I would just I mean, if you thought about it from like an occult perspective, and I do think that there are a few things about the film that make it seem maybe steeped in like some legit like occult perspectives, um, rather than just being a witchy tale, in like the Golden Dawn, or at least particularly Crowley's tarot deck, the Devil card, his title is the Lord of Matter, right? And if you like kind of think about what that means, and if you kind of think about what the Tree of Life in the Kabbalah represents, and certainly, Western occultism is very steeped in like Kabbalistic ideas. So like the idea is like at the very top of the Tree of Life, you have like unformed will, just like the will of existence, and this like prime creative force that is yet to be manifested. But as you go down the Tree of Life, you hit these kind of more profane, increasingly profane manifestations of that initial will. And at the very bottom of the Tree of Life is this realm, the material realm of Earth and biology and whatever. And so this idea of, and like I've only at this point in my studies of this kind of stuff have only read passing reference to this title that, the devil has, as the Lord of Matter. But it's interesting to think about that fall, from grace, that the devil takes, Lucifer takes, and this ever depreciating kind of journey that the will of creation takes to manifestation, right? And so the Lord of Matter, is a really interesting title because it almost suggests that Satan is this recognition of the fall that exists in this plane, like it's the seed of the whole process. It's like the proof that that the fall exists, right? But I think also in that recognition, right, you talk about waking up your ability to connect with that, right? And that's kind of what's represented in terms of what Jian is given in the film, And so this also brings up like the idea of like psychosexual energy and its role in the occult, and how it is like our primary access to that unmanifested will, right? The obviously the movie is steeped in sexual imagery. The devil is literally a dick in the film. So yeah, I think like this interesting awakening of that, but then it's also interesting that it starts as like the profane version with the rape and everything, and how that's connected to power and oppression and control. And what's really crazy is like it empowers her, but it destroys him, like that's.
You're talking about Gene now.
Yeah.
Gene.
Yeah, right. So like
Well, it's the reluctance of Gene and the fact that Gene wasn't seduced by the devil; he was seduced by the court.
True, but I'm just thinking like in the very prelude of the whole thing, they talk about their blissful union, and they're like both head over heels for each other and in this state of just like perfection. And then the rape happens, and there's that weird sequence too where she comes back from the rape and he starts choking her, right? And it almost seems like he murders her. But then it turns out that maybe that was just a dream of his. And so like that, I just think that there's a real complexity to his reaction to the rape. It's like he almost suffers more than her because of it, right? And his whole life is just like this downward spiral after that.
So I read it a little bit different. I thought that the choking scene reminded me of some of it felt very scriptural. There was like this allusion to making the woman low, right? Whatever power, because they don't rape Jean, right? They don't really do anything to Jean. The only time they do something to Jean is probably about 2/3 into not even 2/3, but like a full third into the movie where they chop his hand off for
right, but that's
failure to basically make them greedier, right?
Right, but I mean that's huge though too, in terms of like his character and like, I mean, one, it parallels her bodily harm, right? But then it also is like he finally started to get a semblance of a sense of reanimation, right, after falling so far, and they took that from him, right? Like they took his hand, which was essential for his work, So I saw that as pretty significant.
But I think the distinction still remains where she's brought low and she hits a sort of rock bottom, and she is reminded that because of her lack of power, right, whether it's physical power or political power, because of her lack of power, she is victimized, right? And the scene where Jean strangles her, chokes her, I feel like that's him trying to claim some power of his own after being stripped of power and feeling so helpless, watching his wife being raped, and actually not even allowing for her to be acknowledged as his wife, right? And so all of his agency, all of his will, and all of his intention is taken away from him. And so the act of choking her, he feels. I read it as like, well, he probably feels that that would empower him as well, but then it's fruitless because it doesn't empower him. It just reminds him of how little power he himself really does have, right? And so I think Jan emerges as sort of a heroine because like she really, throughout the entire tale, she has no one that lifts her up, that comes to her aid or her assistance aside from this devil figure, right? Which is also a peculiar figure because it's never acknowledged by any of the other characters in the story. So we don't even know if that's like something that just comes from within her or if it really is like the devil speaking to her, right? And so all the same, it empowers her. And I think with Jean though, with the Jean character, I kept feeling like, man, wouldn't it be great if this character became heroic ever? And he does a bit. But I think that also speaks, and like I said earlier, as a young man, I wasn't compelled to be a feminist or to even care about how all the awful things I did would affect the women that I dealt with. Never once throughout my adolescence or my early adulthood did I once think about how my own personal desires would affect the woman I was with, how that would impact her, how it would linger, any of that. I never once thought about it. Never had to consider it. Why should I ever have to consider that? Like I'm a man. I'm allowed to do whatever the fuck I want, right? Because it's a power that's afforded me. And I always felt that way. And I think Gene is kind of a good role for that, a good role model for that. Like he's kind of portrayed in that same sort of way. where he's constantly feeling this need to feel powerful or recognized or to be respected. Right.
Right.
He
Well,
wants a level of authority.
yeah. I mean, I think I would take everything that you just said because I agree with all of it. But then I would also add the other dimension, which also is kind of in between everything that you just said, and then also everything that I said about the occult. And it's like, I think that on a very, like on a more kind of pedestrian kind of reading, I guess, would be like just the redemption, like I guess the more feminist angle, and like, you know, the end montage kind of proves that it has political awareness, you know, too. So um just like the redemption of female sexuality that takes place in the arc of the movie. And so when Jan is subjected to uh like this very corrupt, disgusting male sexual power, right? And then she's affected by the rape, but then Gene is also subjected to it, and his response to it is also indicative of it, right? Like he's so disgusted by her afterwards that he almost tries to strangle her, or uh, he still like is in this very dark, despondent place, you know, because he can't cope with what happened to her, you know. Um, and so then, yeah, the idea of like this new relationship to her own sexuality, like awakening in her, um, seems to be like kind of the what the devil represents to a certain degree. You know, I don't know if that reading really plays out if you look at the fine details of what the devil says and everything, but just the way that he was presented, like as this sexual organ, and like she approaches it, like I mean, just the baggage that, you know, a devil character would carry with it is that it's this dark thing that we fear, but he turns out to be this redeeming figure, right? And so that's a whole occult thing too, where like Lucifer is the actual redeemer and not Christ. But I don't know enough about that to say anymore. But that's an interesting kind of parallel too.
We have this progression with Jan where she is she at first is seduced into surrendering her body to this devil figure, right? To and I read that as a reawakening, or rather, I should say, a repossessing of her sexuality. Her sexuality was stripped from her. You know, the rape scene is very brutal because it literally shows her being ripped in two. It's gruesome, right?
Right.
And so when she goes back to Gene, one of the few times where they have this when they have more frames of animation, they show his expression as he looks down at her genitals, at her vagina, with this kind of like wistful expression, right? As though it's a scene of a crime, right? It's literally the scene of a crime, and he looks at it as such.
Mm.
And so you can't help but feel as though she's been robbed of some level of sexual agency. She clearly has, right? And so when this devil figure shows up, you know, he takes the form of a phallic sort of shape and tries to seduce her, and she's very reluctant, right? She's very reluctant. It's playful at first, but as she warms to the phallic figure, uh, you kind of see her regaining her sexuality again, regaining her sexual agency.
Yeah.
Um, and she becomes more powerful. You know, that psychosexual power that you talked about before. Right? She grows in power. She grows in wisdom. She's able to assist with the people who are inflicted with the plague, with the bubonic plague. She's able to cure them, to heal them. She's able to get some semblance of political power, even um, to rival that of the court. And when she gives her body wholly, entirely, she gets even more powerful, right? When she uses her body to seduce the money changer, so she herself could supplant him in financial power, right? And so there's these tiers of power that she climbs, right? She has shamanic power, she has financial power, she has political power, right? And there's that last line that she won't cross where she says, I won't give you my soul, and this satanic figure is saying, well, I guess I'll just have to wait for that, right? And it's one of my favorite lines from the movie, actually. And also one of my favorite lines is the fact where she says, she's doing all of this to redeem Gene. She's trying to save him,
Right.
Which I thought was very bittersweet and tragic, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely think it's worth the rewatching. It's a tough watch because it's so, the pacing's not great, and I already told you what I felt about like the psychedelic sequence where it's just I've never liked that in movies. I never liked it in like the Bakshi films or Bakshi, whatever that got, Ralph Bakshi films. Yeah. I don't like it here. It feels like a non sequitur every single time.
Yeah, I mean, there's the one particular jarring sequence in this film in Belladonna where it's just like totally anachronistic.
Yeah,
right? Like it looks like a Sesame Street segue or something.
Yeah, exactly.
But so yeah, that is weird, and I don't necessarily know what to make of it. I could maybe tease a reading out of it, but like, yeah, I don't know what that was about, and it just would be as great if it wasn't there, So, but as far as like
I actually think it'd be better if it weren't there.
Yeah, that's what I meant. But as far as the style of the rest of the movie, I didn't have any aesthetic problems with it necessarily.
I love the style of the movie. I thought that it was so brilliant the way that they showed Jan kind of freeing the village people, getting them to her side, and how they gradually progress, and is this releasing of that sexual gate, that sexual tension, the liberation, the empowerment, the empowering of these people, and again, it also goes right back to the power dynamics that we've been talking about this entire time, where what are the tools that they use to have authority over us. And one of the ways they have authority over us is by telling us that our bodies are dirty and that we have to keep our sexualities in check because sexuality is a threat to their authority. Right. And just I'm doing the chef's kiss right now. Mwah, perfect. That scene where that orgy is such a threat to these people, these figures, the court. I don't know how you could have done it better with that art style at all. I don't know how you could have done it better. Period. And it's a testament to the medium that you can't really do that in a real movie. So we were talking earlier about, I don't know if it was Crowley that you had mentioned, who he has a tarot deck,
right?
Where Satan is the king of matter, or a being of matter, or represents matter.
Lord of the gates of matter, I think is the way it's phrased. But yeah.
And so, if the existence in Eden, if when Adam and Eve were in Eden, they were more spiritual beings. They were spirit beings. They were perfect. Matter didn't matter to them. They weren't constrained by matter. There was no danger of them going hungry. There was no need for them to have clothes. There was no need for them to build fires. The way that we treat matter now, they never had to treat matter that way, right?
Right.
And it's when they're they're kicked out of Eden, when they're kicked out of the garden, all of a sudden those concerns arise. They have to clothe themselves from the harsh conditions, right? They have to kill, they have to gather wood, they have to, and so they have a very distinct, or rather a very different relationship with the matter that surrounds them. All of a sudden, matter does matter, right? And so if Satan is sort of like that that alchemical transition from not having a concern about, an equilibrium, a physical equilibrium, and then all of a sudden having a concern about physical equilibrium, existing in physical equilibrium with your surroundings. I think that's very interesting, right? Because you could imagine people being very frustrated with that, right? The descendants of Adam and Eve being very frustrated with the fact that, I have to eat or else I starve. I have to chop wood or else I freeze. I have to build myself a shelter or else the wild animals, the wild beasts will devour me. And so that dependence on matter and how to tame matter, how to utilize matter, how to hone matter into something useful, also brings with it that constant feeling of insecurity, a constant dread of the elements and the beasts that exists out in the wild. And how Satan is the key to all of that, or the gate to all that, right? That relationship with matter.
Mm.
So yeah, I find that really interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Where,
Yeah, I mean, like,
and also, yeah, just to to say something else, add something else to that.
Mhm.
When we look at the current church, for instance, we look at how it's almost kind of satanic, right? Because they themselves are obsessed with matter. They're obsessed with the adornments of the church, the robes, the what is it called, the mitre, the
Right.
staffs, the incense. I just watched a YouTube video how like frankincense and myrrh is actually really expensive, and the largest purchaser of frankincense and myrrh is the Roman Church, and this whole industry is just there to burn incense to dull our senses during mass, right?
Right.
And so it's very sensual. It's extremely sensual, and it's all about material. It's all about, the gold that's used to, adorn the thrones and the cross and all these things. Very, very. It's just a gathering of wealth, right? It's a storeroom of wealth. A lot of these churches, right?
Mhm.
And that's kind of satanic. The cure to that would be a real, actual entheogenic experience with the Eucharist.
Yes. The many faces that, or the many roles or perceptions that we could have of Satan, many different interpretations, and like from like being this evil figure to being more redemptive figure. I don't know. It's all part of the same story, though. Is my point. Different interpretations kind of harmonize with each other. There is the idea that this realm is like the lowliest realm, and it contains suffering. And there's three other realms of the tree of life, and they're like very distinctly marked, and they have like a very distinct metaphysical philosophy behind them. And so like to think about what realm the Garden of Eden would be in is an interesting question to think about too. But yeah, like the arrival here with yes, exactly, like all the trappings of mortality is definitely like the fall from grace. And it's understood that this realm is the realm of suffering and mortality and hunger and everything. But at the same time, like it's inextricable from the will that spawned it, right? And it's kind of like the idea of a rainbow where white light contains like all the colors unrefracted, you know. And so the manifestation, the world manifest is like the many colors, but it's still the white light too at the same time. And like that's what's really interesting about the way Satan is portrayed in Belladonna, because he seems to be the figure that like unlocks that secret. So it's like, I guess it's the conflict between seeing the satanic revelry in matter, right, and like that evil of greed and corruption and control, but then there's also the idea that it's this path to redemption too, and this awakening of the psychosexual power, and seeing the spirit. I mean, like that's literally the alchemical goal, right? Is to redeem the spirit in matter, you know, um, like word for word. So that's really interesting too. So I don't know. It's just like I said, it's that kind of dichotomy.
I wanted to ask you before we wrap things up, if you had to say definitively what Jan's powers were. What powers did she gain throughout Belladonna of Sadness?
Hmm. Well, I mean, maybe it's just because it's what I've been reading a lot lately, but I have a hard time not seeing it connected to like the more occult interpretation. I mean, you know, she's literally a witch, so there's that. But I mean, I would put it in at least a couple different categories. Like one, it's the redemption of her body and sexuality, like for herself,
Mm-hmm.
um, and finding empowerment in that. But then I think it's also the bigger picture of communion, right? Like, so I guess I would also say that like we've talked about these ideas kind of before in different contexts, because we watched that movie Dark Song, which like my conclusion of that movie anyway was that it's a pretty earnest and uh, sympathetic interpretation of the occult, or representation of the occult, in a cool way that's kind of unexpected. And then the other piece of media that I really, really admire that has these strong occult underpinnings is Westworld. Not the original film, but the series on HBO. And particularly that first season, which is super masterful and like divinely written and just like entirely self-contained, where you don't even have to pay attention to anything else besides that first season. The way it coalesces and like the themes that are coalescing are just like mind-blowing to me. But I think Belladonna of Sadness and Westworld have a lot of thematic parallels. So like the whole idea of these cyborgs, whatever you want to call them, robots, the whole idea of them like following the maze and finding that inner self, and it being the key to unlocking their consciousness, right? So I mean, like Westworld is like a huge kind of complicated metaphor, because you could read it in ways that are not necessarily occult, but I think the bottom line is that it's a system of control, right? And it's a system of exploitation. And you know, we as the audience wind up identifying with the robots rather than the human beings, because the human beings are horrible and they're monsters, and we identify with the oppressed and the controlled. So the journey of these robots to gain consciousness is really our journey to gain consciousness and to throw off the yoke of oppression and control, right? So this method of reaching this version of yourself, right? It's very much akin to the idea of meeting your holy guardian angel, which is a theme in Dark Song, right? So like I think it's also a pretty decent interpretation of Belladonna, because it's like, yeah, this force comes to Jean, and like you said, it's like self-contained. No one else ever sees this devil, and it's misgendered too, right? He's definitely representative of a penis rather than a vagina, but this idea that you're seeking this entity that's outside yourself, but the true meeting of this entity is to realize that it is yourself, um, and that's the whole lesson, like that. Um, like I said, like if you interpret the fall of Lucifer to represent the fall of the primordial will into matter, right? Then Lucifer is, the light bearer, which is kind of interesting, but he's the white light that is still contained in the rainbow, right? He's the evidence that it was refracted, that it came from somewhere else. So again, like that's everything, the hermetic axiom of as above so below is really what we should reach for, because it's the idea that, like, yeah, we could recognize all this um, philosophy and metaphysics in the world around us, but we, as above so below, means it's also the world within us, right? And so that's the thing too. We are also rainbows, and we also have the unrefracted white light within us, So awakening the psychosexual power is to awaken God himself, Um, it's to awaken creation, And so, yeah, I mean, like when it comes to also shamanic visions and dreams, I think, like, dreams are literally the regeneration of culture, right? And that's where art comes from. And I think that's what art's true purpose and holy mission is, right? To challenge stagnant ways of narrating the world around us, right? So it, I feel like art is only truly art when it's iconoclastic, So yeah, I think like that's a huge part of her power, right? Is to remind people that they're capable of not just psychosexual power, but of like this dream state, And I mean, again, like it's certainly part of Marescu's book that talks about, like, these weren't just drug ceremonies; they were orgiastic drug ceremonies, And that, I could think of a ton of Terence McKenna talks too about the original purpose of shamanism and that obliteration of boundaries, right? Like you said, it was depicted perfectly in the film Belladonna, because it was like this river of unity, and the dissolving of boundaries, right? And boundaries are what create royalty, that they're what create billionaires, they're what create systems of control and hierarchies of power. So they're also what create poverty. So I guess from whatever angle you want to take on her powers, I think the ultimate kind of revelation that she was offering is just liberation, right?
Yeah. So for me, I think sequentially, you have the power to self-heal. So she heals herself of the wounds inflicted her by the rape, of course. Then we have the power of accepting her sexuality, embracing her sexuality. Uh, then there's the act of healing others. All right. Uh, there's the act of forgiving, actually, because I want to say that she forgives her husband. She forgives Gene maybe like 3 times in total. She forgives him after the strangling. She forgives him after not opening the door for her when she's being hunted down while wearing the green cloak,
Right.
and she forgives him again shortly before she's set to the fire.
Right.
Right. And so there's that power of forgiveness. and she has the power to teach. She ends up teaching the other villagers. She ends up teaching the page on how to seduce the lady of the court. And I wonder if like the sequence of those powers, how they emerge, how they kind of define her struggle, how each of those powers, in and of their own ways, are challenges to hierarchy, whether it's like forgiveness, whether it's enriching the lowest, whether it's teaching the lowest. These are all challenges to hierarchy, challenges to power, to actual top-down power, that is. Fake power, right? These are challenges to fake power. These are challenges to false power. These real empowering things are challenges to the falsehood of top-down authority, right? And I wonder if there's like if that's intentionally calling back to a shamanistic or an occultic progression akin to what you're saying. And I was curious about that. I actually did wonder if this was part of a schema, if this was like a prescribed schema for how you progress through a certain esoteric or hermetic sort of progression. I don't know, but it was very interesting to look at. But yeah, I'm curious how, especially towards the end, where you have that, like you said, the montage that talks about the French Revolution and the women who led the French Revolution. And I remembered, I don't think I liked that very much when I first saw it, but the more I thought about it, I wondered to myself, like, are the producers suggesting, and I don't know how much of this is in the book, maybe the book originally suggested this, is the book or the producers, is someone here suggesting that Jan's potential, right, was somehow arrested, right? It was somehow retarded because of her love for Jean, her reluctance to have her power transcend Jean, where she didn't want. And like you say, if it's not so much that she would be selling her soul or giving her soul, surrendering her soul to Satan, she'd be surrendering her soul to herself. Right. Because again, I don't know if the satanic figure is really supposed to be a representation of Satan or just a representation of her pent up power. So is she reluctant to surrender herself to herself because she is too committed to Jean? That those very halcyon, pure images of love that the movie begins with, is she so committed to those images that she won't allow herself to become powerful? And so when we transition to the images of the women leading the French Revolution, these are women who wouldn't allow themselves to be trapped in that sort of way, the same way that Jan was.
Well, I mean, okay, yeah, so I was going to ask you why you thought those end images represented that idea that she was too beholden to Jean, but I mean,
because they ultimately cut the heads off of their oppressors, whereas
yeah,
Jan
but I mean,
didn't.
like, well, yeah. So I guess that would be the question then, is like, if you think that she's a failure or not. But I don't know. I didn't see it that way necessarily. Like
No, not so much a failure, but that potential, that material potential to realize the full extent of her power was governed by her love for Jean.
So I guess I would say then, what makes you read her demise as connected to love for Jean?
I only say that because of the juxtaposition with the montage at the end, where you have where we have Jan in opposition to the authority of her time, and you have the women, the images of those women in opposition to the authorities of their time, and how they were painted as just being successful. And so if they're painted as being successful, was it the intent of the producers or the book or what have you to show that Jan's potential was thwarted?
But I don't think her potential is thwarted. You know, like I think she became a martyr first of all. You know, and like I think that that's really the connection between the final scenes of her and then the images of the French Revolution afterwards, is to say that like her martyrdom is what inspired this, you know, righteous revolution. So um, I think that's one way of looking at it. But to put finer detail on it, I would say that like, you know, the choice that she's making at the end, I don't see it having much to do with Jean. I mean, like I think like, you know, they have that kind of sense of reconciliation before she dies, but like the reason why she's put to death is pretty righteous though.
The reason why I say that she is still limited, like Jean plays a limiting factor for her, is because when the satanic figure says to her, "When will you give me? When will you surrender your soul to me? Like,
Uh-huh.
I have your body, but when will you surrender your soul to me?" And she refuses. She says, "That's the line I won't cross. I'm doing all of this for Jean." Right. And so that's why I'm saying that uh, if she were to relinquish, going back to, you know, your the reading that you had just posited. So going back to that, if the full realization of the alchemical path is to embrace yourself, right? If like her going fully in is, you know, if she's giving her soul to this satanic figure, this devil
Right, right.
figure,
But
that's just
I
her
got
meeting herself, right? That's
yeah,
her realizing herself. She
I get
never
what
gets.
yeah, I get what you're saying, but I think like two things. Like one would be that I feel like that scene where you're talking about with her soul and the devil comes a little bit earlier than like the really dead end of the movie, like literally like before she gets burnt. Um, and that the exchange that like literally puts her at the stake is with the emperor dude, right? And so he offers her like these, you know, increasingly sweet deals to surrender to him. Um, and it's like first it's like a patch of land and freedom with Jean, right? And so like even that, like if that's her main goal, then she should have just taken that offer and she would have saved him and her, and given them a comfortable life. Um, but then it's like she is not budging, so he keeps increasing to the point where he says, "You'd be second in power to me. You would rule over everything, and you would only be subservient to me." And she says no to that too, and he says, "Well, what do you want?" And she says, "I want the whole world." And that's what puts her to death, you know. So I think that's fucking righteous as fuck, and I think that that's totally in line with like the autonomy that she gained, and that sets up her martyrdom, you know.
I I I still, yeah. I guess you're right. Yeah.
I mean, the question about her soul is definitely interesting, and it's something that I don't know if I have like a good reading for, but
Yeah,
um,
and I guess that's where I am right now. Is I wonder. I feel like that's something that's teased. The potential that she has to be something else, she never crosses that line. Um,
but I mean, she is something else. She's
no, something else from what we see is what I'm saying. So
okay,
I'm
yeah.
I'm wondering if there could have been another
Well,
progression for her
wouldn't
uh, that
wouldn't
that does fully cross that line.
but maybe it's totally harmonious with what she tells the emperor, you know, like if she didn't have her, if she gave away her soul, she would be subservient, right? So like that's actually her ultimate power, maybe. Well, it's self-liberation, you know, so it's like only someone who's self-liberated can offer others liberation, right? And she proves herself to be ungovernable, right?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely appreciate, like, I love that scene. I think it's great. I think it's, the power of it, and makes her so heroic.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's redemptive. She goes from being raped to rejecting everything that an emperor could offer her because he has nothing to offer, and she recognizes as much.
Right.
Uh, so yeah, that's very powerful. But on an internal level, yeah, I still wonder what the importance of her dialogues with that satanic figure, how much they factor into the development of her character, how much they factor into the development of her heroism.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think maybe that's even specifically when I said before that I could give this occult interpretation, but I said I don't know if it lines up with every single detail of the devil's dialogue. Maybe that's even exactly what was in the back of my mind as like that one particular scene, because it does bring up this like other connotation of like the kind of Faustian style tale of power for, but I mean, again, it's like I think it's the Faust tale is like trading power for humanity and trading power for subservience, right? So like you're losing your humanity by usurping God's natural order of things. But maybe that's what the kind of occult Luciferian tale is that like God's order of things is a lie, and that we shouldn't be subservient to anything.
I think it's very deliberate when I think it's the page, right? When the page comes to the witch, comes to Jan and asks for help in getting the lady to fall in love with him.
Right.
He says something along the lines of, how could I reject power? Power is God given.
Mm.
And I thought that was such a great, deliberate line. And so, again, I wonder what the intent is, right? I wonder what the intent is of having this pop up satanic figure that grows in stature as she grows in power and grows in influence. It starts out like a wisp, like a thought. It starts out like a thought, like an invading thought, and it gradually gets larger and larger and larger.
She's literally at the very first meeting like jerking him off because he's shaped like a penis in her hand.
Right.
And so it's like this playful, mindless act almost.
Yeah, and how he just grows to be this thing that seemingly interacts with the orgy, I guess, and how that stands in defiance to the God granted power of the court. And so, yeah, I do wonder what the intention of those dichotomies, that dichotomy. What is the intention there? What is meant to be gleaned from that? I don't know. Maybe it's not important, but ultimately, she ends up being a martyr. She ends up being a heroine. Um, I do like the scene where the villagers that scorned her earlier in the movie, where they do want to save her,
Mm.
and they're kept at bay by the spearsmen. Um, I thought that was a pretty nice touch, interesting touch, because it shows that she has successfully transformed the villagers. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely super righteous on a bunch of levels. I didn't really know what to expect from the movie at all. I just had known that it was maybe a little bit witchy and that it was a cool early example of Japanese animation, but I didn't expect it to be so like heavy and richly layered. This is the Still Human podcast. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more episodes.